Hello YouTube. Christopher Columbus is one of the most mysterious figures in world history. I have researched his voyages, but only superficially, basically as part of my main study of the Spanish conquest of Florida and ancient paranormal phenomena in Florida. However, Alexander Bushkov, he's a well-known and popular author of thrillers, detective novels, and books about enigmas of world history, and he's in Russia. Well, he researched the life of Christopher Columbus in much greater detail. Allow me to introduce you to his conclusions. They're very interesting. As for my research of Florida, someday I'll talk about it. The indigenous people of Florida lived in what is now known as Florida for more than 12,000 years, before the time of the first contact with the Europeans. There were people well before 12,000 years too. Have you heard, by the way, about the Calusa people? You will from me in the future. I did some field research in that area many years ago. But back to Columbus. Let's start with the fact that Columbus can be attributed entirely to the words that the Russian writer Strugatsky once characterized one of their protagonists. He is nobody. He's from nowhere. Indeed, Columbus is basically shrouded in utter obscurity. If you look at the history available, his real name is unknown. His Hispanicized version of his name, Colon, Pigeon, may turn out to be either a nickname or, as some historians believe, an abbreviation of the word coronel, colonel, column. According to other hypotheses, this is how sailors respectfully address the commanders of ships, sometimes like chief or boss. And Columbus is not a particular Italian surname. It is interesting that the nickname Colon was also carried by the contemporary of Columbus, the Italian privateer in the French service, Guillaume Casanova. By coincidence, both of those columns, or colonne, met at sea. In 1476, Casanova attacked the Flemish squadron, where Columbus sailed as a sailor on one of the ships, and sank the very ship where Columbus was stationed. Christopher Columbus, barely escaped by swimming. Fortunately, it was not far from the shore when it went down. His parents are basically unknown, although it is believed that Columbus was the son of the Genova weaver Domenico Colombo, but there is no man with that name in the surviving lists of the masters of the Weavers Guild. And the house in Genoa on Dante Square, where Columbus was supposedly born, it's nothing more than a prop for tourists, like Sherlock Holmes' apartment on Baker Street. It is not known in which city Columbus was born after all. Only in the Italian province of Liguria, 4 coastal cities, Genoa, Savona, Cogoleto, and Nervi, are still arguing for the honor of being considered the birthplace of Columbus. Plus, more than a dozen Italian cities in other provinces also claim it. Since the nationality of Columbus is also unknown, 8 countries claim to be his homeland, including, of course, Italy. A Polish researcher once put forward a hypothesis that Columbus is the Gdańsk navigator Jan of Kolno, in Polish Jan z Kolno. According to this hypothesis, Kolno is either a now forgotten and renamed village, or German Cologne, Köln, which, as we remember, is still written in Polish Kolonia, and therefore, according to the inquisitive researcher, in the old days the city of Cologne could well be written Kolno. The Polish word pigeon, golomb, is somehow very suspiciously consonant with Columbus, and in Gdańsk they love to call ships by the names of birds, golomb, orzel, jaskolka. We'll talk more about Jan from Kolno, who was a real person, in more detail later. 8 countries and a dozen cities, so those who lay claim to Columbus. In itself, such an abundance of candidates makes one think that the truth will remain unknown forever. There is even a hypothesis that Columbus was a Jew. Alas, there are not enough arguments to back it, not enough evidence. But seriously, the first more or less reliable traces of Columbus appear only in 1473, when he was 23 years old. A document discovered in the last century dates back to about this time, where the Venice Maritime Court warns about the pirate Colombo, who is in the service of the Anjou Duke René. We are speaking about our Columbus, so to say, Christopher Columbus. He himself, in his mature years, more than once recalled the service of Duke René, to whom he treated with sympathy. René of Anjou, in Italian Renato, was the Duke of Anjou and Count of Provence from 1434 to 1480. He also reigned as the King of Naples, René I. And he is known in France as a good King René, because he spent some years in the Auge de Provence, if I pronounce it right. So, the pirate is a relative and extendable concept. Firstly, in those days, as well as many years later, piracy was considered to be a gentleman-worthy occupation. Secondly, we're talking here more about a privateer, a private person with a patent of this or that ruler sinking the ships of the country with which this ruler is at war, or is simply having bad relations. In general, the fate of Columbus is very rich in twists and turns. After a privateer service with Duke René, for some reasons, he suddenly turned out to be a simple sailor on the Flemish merchant ship. He even went to a monastery for a short time, and in those turbulent times, many people sometimes did it. People who needed to, so to say, to sit out in the quiet and relative seclusion until their other deeds were forgotten in the big world. The story of how Columbus visited and pleaded for his project in the royal courts of Portugal and Spain for many years, it is well known, and there is no point in retelling it. Therefore, let's go straight to the oddities that accompanied this odyssey. The paranormal angle will be explored later in this video. Let's look at other oddities first. It is not entirely clear at first why the Portuguese king treated Columbus so indifferently, and the terms of the contract that the Spanish royal couple signed with Columbus before he sailed in search of America, well, the terms, they look strange. Generosity in Spain was unheard of before, but with Columbus it was really fabulous and incredible, this generosity. The Spanish kings always paid generously with the sailors who opened new lands for the state, but this has never happened before. The nobility and the hereditary title of admiral of the sea, ocean, and all the islands and continents that he will discover, the title of viceroy and chief ruler of these lands, with the right to appoint governors himself, a tenth of all the loot taken in the newly discovered colonies, and Columbus himself pays only 1/8 of the cost of equipping the ships, and everything else is to be paid by the royal couple. It is well known that most of these promises have remained unfulfilled. Inevitably, both oddities should be considered in conjunction. Columbus was the only one who was promised such a generous reward, and the only one of all the captains in the Spanish service in settlements with whom the Spanish royalty did not fulfill the conditions. The Spanish monarchs had a lot of shortcomings, for sure, but in such cases they always paid honestly. So why did they do this to Columbus? Perhaps because the achievements of Columbus were not at all as impressive as we consider them today, or even because America was it opened a little later than the official date, although still with the participation of Columbus that it was discovered. Let's move on to the question of predecessors. It has become commonplace to repeat that Columbus was not the first to discover the New World, America. But it's not the Vikings we should be interested in right now, but explorers closer in time to Columbus, about whom he could know quite a lot. There is information that in 1390 the Venetian Niccolo Zeno sailed to America on behalf of Scottish Prince Sinclair, accompanied by his brother Antonio and the prince himself. Some researchers fervently defend the authenticity of the so-called Zeno book, travel diaries, maps, and letters. These materials were kept in the Venetian archives, and Venice and Genoa are close neighbors. The authenticity of the letter of the Florentine physician and amateur cosmographer Paolo Toscanelli to King Afonso V of Portugal, also known as the African, of June 15, 1474, is absolutely not in doubt. The king, nephew of the famous Enrique the Navigator, who received this name not for his own voyages, but for the great work of organizing the voyages of the Portuguese captains. Well, this King Afonso V, through his courtiers, asked Toscanelli for advice. Is it possible to reach India if you sail to the west? Toscanelli replied, the existence of such a path can be proved on the basis of the spherical shape of the earth, and attached a hand-drawn map. At about the same time, a remarkable coincidence, by the way, King Afonso sends an expedition in search of the northern sea route to Asia and India. Well, first two Norwegian captains reach the shores of North America. To them, the Portuguese João Vaz Corte-Real was attached as an observer. There are letters and messages that are not in doubt. The expedition visited Newfoundland and Labrador. A little later, in 1476, the second expedition leaves along the same route, again Scandinavian-Portuguese mix. It is commanded either by Jen Skulno or by Jens Skolno, and he sails on one of the ships. You know who was there? Christopher Columbus. Historians have long noted that the ideas of the western way to India began to excite Columbus around 1479, after the end of the expedition, unless he decided to sail a little further south. By the way, from the scanty evidence of these two voyages, it does not at all follow all incontrovertibility that Jens Skolno and Christopher Columbus are two different people. They could have been one and the same. Maybe it was one of the same person, yes, and the Paul who was mentioned before was not really such a storyteller. It becomes clear why Portugal reacted so coolly, so indifferently to Columbus's plans. There were their own plans, no wars, and of course very experienced captains. Now let's talk England. About 30 years ago, Professor Taylor in England analyzed reports and lists of cargo that ships imported and exported to Bristol, and he noticed some curious absurdities. According to the official declarations, most of the captains traded with Ireland, but the time spent on the itinerary did not correspond to this. A certain Captain Maurice Targat sailed to Ireland and back in 115 days. That would be enough to make around three times. The professor concluded that in fact that the brave sailors did not sail to Ireland at all, so where did they sail to? It is possible they did sail to America. It was from Bristol in the spring of 1498 that John Cabot sailed to America. He is also a Genova man, Giovanni Gabotto, who settled in England 8 years before. And a professor of geography at the University of Exeter, Davis, believes that back in 1477, a well-known Welsh smuggler, John Lloyd, regularly visited Greenland. That's in the years when Columbus, by the way, visited England. Reports that Columbus knew quite well where to sail are numerous. Moroccan professor Mohammed El-Fassi claims that Columbus visited Morocco, where he learned about the ancient transatlantic route of the Berbers, who once sailed to America. Whether this is true or not, it is not exactly known, but Columbus in 1419 visited Guinea, on the country that is neighbor of Morocco, and he probably visited that country twice. A famous sailor and geographer, author of famous maps, Turkish Admiral Piri Reis, directly wrote that the news had spread that an infidel by name of Colon Bo learned from some old books about the existence of a vast land. Moreover, from the same books, Colon Bo learned that the inhabitants of these lands adore glass jewelry and are ready to exchange this jewelry for gold, and that's why he took more of this jewelry with him. Garcilaso de la Vega's book about the Inca state, published in 1609 in Lisboa, echoes this testimony. Garcilaso claims that around year 1484, the pilot from Huelva, Alonso Sanchez, on his way to Madeira, got into a severe storm for about a month, and the storm carried his boat until it washed up on an unknown island, presumably Haiti. Sanchez managed to return to Europe, having lost 12 of 17 crew members, and then they stayed at the house of the famous Christopher Columbus, a Genovese, man from Genova, because they knew him as a great pilot and cartographer who compiled maps for navigation. And since they arrived exhausted by the work they had endured in the past, no matter how much Christopher Columbus gifted them, they didn't come to their senses, and all died in his house, leaving him a legacy of the works that brought them death, and which the great Columbus undertook to complete with such an enthusiasm and strength that if he had to endure the same suffering or even greater, he would still take the case to transfer Spain's new world and its riches. Well, the easiest way is to refer to the eternal dislike of the Portuguese for long-standing military opponents and competitors in the capture of distant lands, the Spaniards. But Garcilaso is clearly friendly to Columbus. He says, what's wrong with Columbus using maps and records of the deceased people? We can mention much less significant, but still interesting facts. The helmsman Martin Vicente and the governor of Porto Santo Correa found in the sea and on the shore, they found incomprehensible wooden objects processed by the human hand, strange trees, plants, and fruits. There are even mentions of two unusual, non-European looking drowned people caught off the island of Flores in the Azores archipelago. Vicente was a friend of Columbus, and Correa was Columbus's father-in-law. Many researchers have long been paying attention to the oddities of Columbus' journey. He sailed there and back as if he knew in advance the approximate distance to India, so to say, knew about the existence of a strong ocean current which helped those sailing in a westerly direction. He knew about the winds. His itinerary, which Columbus fiercely insisted on observing, coincided with this current and the direction of constant winds, so much that, according to Bushkov, it's even a shame to talk about luck. By the way, there is no reliable evidence that anyone even saw the curiosities brought by Columbus from his first trip. The authenticity of a significant part of his letters, reports, and diaries have been disputed, or has been disputed for a long time, not without reason. For some reason, Columbus's grave turned out to be full obscurity and very quickly forgotten where it is, so that the burial place of Columbus will forever remain a mystery. That's according to Bushkov. I've heard different things, but I won't get into this right now. You can look it up yourself. And finally, at the end of the 1970s, the Italian historian Marinella Bonvina Mazzanti discovered in the archives of the city of Modena a letter from the Napolitano envoy to Barcelona, Annibale de Gennaro, sent on March 9, 1493, to a brother who basically held the same post in Milan. Among other Spanish news, Gennaro reports specifically, a few days ago Columbus returned, who set off last August with 4 ships on a voyage across the Great Ocean. The oddities begin here. First, 4 ships, while tradition stubbornly attributes 3 ships to Columbus. Besides, the flagship of Columbus, Santa Maria, perished off the American coast, so there should be only 2 left. Secondly, the official approved, so to say, official date of return of Columbus from the transatlantic voyage has always been considered the 15th of March of 1493. Moreover, March 9 is the day when Annibale learned about the arrival of the ships of Columbus in Palos, and from Palos to Barcelona as much as 900 kilometers, if you count in a straight line. Rivers, mountains, highwaymen and robbers in the woods, terrible road conditions. An Italian traveler in 1419 boasted that he had traveled 700 miles in just 16 days. Although he was driving on much more convenient roads in lowland Germany and Italy, and not in mountainous Spain. So what's the conclusion? If we take into the account Gennaro's letter, it turns out that Columbus returned to Palos de la Frontera much earlier than the official date, somewhere in the 20th of February. 2 weeks later, the news of this reached Barcelona. Why was there such a confusion with the dates, intentionally or accidentally? Please note, for some reason, Gennaro does not mention the magnificent event at all, the discovery of new lands across the ocean. Can you imagine that information about this did not reach him? Unlikely. Did those who brought the news of Columbus's return not specify what exactly he accomplished? Or maybe all the news was just that Columbus returned from his voyage. And the talk about the discovery of America, it started being disseminated in a couple of weeks. And Columbus simply sailed in the ocean, but because of a crew mutiny or lack of water, he was forced to return before reaching India. That's how they refer to the New World. The motives of the Spanish crown, which decided to falsify the event, are clear. There was a downright frenzied rivalry between Spain and Portugal for new lands, despite the fact that, as we see, both the British and the Scandinavians also sailed to the west. Bushkov formed the following hypothesis. Although Columbus's voyage ended in failure, a brilliant decision came to someone's clever head at the Spanish court to consider victory a defeat and the discovery a success. Too many people know about the existence of new lands across the ocean. The news that Columbus finally managed to reach them will not cause much surprise, but to check it out with the statement is extremely difficult. Spain gets the opportunity to scream, to shout to the entire civilized world of the time, "Our captain discovered the lands. From now on, they are ours. Anyone who encroaches will cause a war. We will stand for our new territories to the last. They are ours. They're open to us. So hands off." This is about how the Spanish government acted after the 15th of March, 1493. Next year, it is seeking confirmation from the Pope of the exclusive rights of the Spanish crown to everything that the Spanish captains have already opened up, so to say, and will open again in the Western Hemisphere. In other words, the Spaniards take an exclusive to America. the Pope draws a dividing line across the globe. The globe already existed at that time as an object. The unkind neighbors, the Portuguese, are forced to settle for India. By the way, real India. By the way, those who like to mention the backwardness and ignorance of the church at the time should be reminded that the Tordesillas Treaty of 1494 legitimizes the idea of the spherical shape of the earth. And only a year or two later, the real voyages to America begin. Columbus and the young Hidalgo Alonso de Ojeda perfectly documented. Those voyages ended with the delivery to Spain of the very gold and very real Indians, about which the acceptance certificates remained in history. No one ever suspected that Columbus's first voyage was a fiction. In fact, it was simply impossible to check veracity in a short time. At the same time, the Portuguese captain Gaspar Corte-Real disappeared with his ship and his brother, the real rivals of the Spaniards, disappeared just as mysteriously. Perhaps this explains such a strange corresponding ingratitude of the Spanish royal couple to Columbus. In fact, Columbus had nothing for them to pay for. He didn't do anything. And later, when he, vulgarly speaking, tries to screw something up, they put him in jail and let him out when they got convinced, the royal couple, that the lesson has been learned for the future, and the captain will neither talk nor demand the unearned rewards. Bushkov does not at all claim that this was the case, but it could have been. There are too many mysteries, contradictions, and direct oddities. Speaking of America, more precisely about its name, allegedly given in honor of Amerigo Vespucci. Vespucci, of course, was an outstanding scientist of his time. In honor of other captains, of course, sometimes parts of the newly discovered lands were called. There was, for example, at one time on the maps, the land of João Vaz Corte-Real, and a certain bay is still called Hudson's Bay, right? But a whole vast continent to be named in honor of the man who made only one voyage as part of the Ojeda's expedition in 1492 in already open lands. There's a more elegant hypothesis. John Cabot's second expedition to the overseas lands, they were financed by Bristol merchants, and the largest contribution was made by a merchant and a customs foreman named Richard, and whose surname was Amerique. Could Cabot have named the lands he discovered in honor of the sponsor? Why not? Moreover, the author of the Chronicle of the Whole World, the Krakow Polish historian Marcin Belski, in 1554 wrote this: Americus Vespucci is nicknamed by the name of the great island of America. Not that the continent was named after Vespucci, but Vespucci was named in honor of the lands that he described. It is not known how everything happened in those distant centuries, but the fact, one thing remains. Christopher Columbus is one of the most mysterious figures in the world. And with all this, we have UFOs too. The last place where you expect to find mentions of one of these extraterrestrial ships is the Christopher Columbus's journal or logbook. In fact, his family considered this event significant, and it was mentioned several times in the writings of his heirs. This is not Bushkov, this is other research. A strange series of events begins to unfold on September 13, when Columbus and 3 ships under his command were in the area now known as the Bermuda Triangle, assuming the veracity of the voyage. The first mention of the supposed strange events in the American sky actually occurred on September 15, 1492, when Columbus wrote this: That day and night he sailed 27 leagues on his way to the west and several more, and that night at the beginning of it, they saw a wonderful fiery branch falling from the sky into the sea 4 to 5 leagues away from them. The description that the sailor gave is quite understandable for those who do not know other explanations except for what the wisdom of that time allowed. So what could it be? The admiral noticed that the arrow of his compass began to work erratically and no longer pointed to the North Star. The incident was repeated on the 17th and the 20th. Columbus wrote in his logbook, "The pilots observed the northern point and found that the arrows turned a whole point to the west of the north. The sailors were alarmed and dejected and did not explain the reasons. But the admiral knew about it and ordered to watch the north again at dawn. Then they discovered that the needles were real. The reason is that a bright star makes movement, not needles. The mention of a bright star moving across the night sky is unusual in itself, but in combination with subsequent events, it paints an unorthodox picture. As Columbus later told his loved ones, the bright star was seen on other nights, which made him and his people suspect that something supernatural was following them. 6 centuries ago, sailors were much more superstitious than they are now. So you can imagine how disturbing the sight was. At the 22 hours on October 11, Columbus patrolled the deck of the Santa Maria. The morale of his crew was very low morale, I should say. And homesick people had already threatened to turn around and sail back to Spain. While pondering what to do, the strangest incident interrupted his train of thought. In the excerpt from Columbus's journal, historian Bartolome de las Casas notes, "The admiral at 10 o'clock, while on deck, saw a light flickering at a great distance, although it was so uncertain that he could not tell whether he landed or not. He called Pedro Gutierrez and said it looked like there was a light and that he should look at it. He did it and saw it. During that night, the light disappeared several times and reappeared, changing the altitude in sudden and fleeting glimpses. According to other sources, the light was first seen under the waves, and then it ascended into the sky." Certain ufologists believe that Christopher Columbus encountered a USO during his trip. The historical significance of his journey gave rise to the suspicion for some people that the Columbus expedition was closely watched by an alien ship, piloted by a team or crew whose motives remain unknown. In addition, the observation time is another proof that the aliens were well aware of Columbus's plan and difficulties, if the voyage took place. We just don't know enough. We can guess and guess. I think time and further research will tell, and of course underwater archaeology, hopefully. But let me say a few words about the Calusa of Florida. The Calusa may have been the only ancient people in North America who established a kingdom without practicing agriculture. Their sophistication and fierceness, bravery, enabled them to resist Spanish domination for almost 200 years. We will look at their mysteries some other day, but I'll tell you, if I had the chance to do underwater archaeological research, and if the state of Florida allowed it, I would be in the waters of Marco Island tomorrow. So I thank you for your attention to my work, and if you can support me, please find the links in the description of this video, and please subscribe to my channel, and I hope to bring you more interesting investigations soon.